Hello, everyone. My name is Zion, and this is my final presentation. And I'm going to be talking about domestic violence and how it could be a hindrance within the family structure and the overall happiness that a family could have. Domestic violence is considered as violent acts between family members or between partners in intimate or dating relationships. Domestic violence takes many forms: physical, emotional, economic, stalking and harassment, and sexual. Physical abuse is any threat or action that causes pain to the physical body. Emotional, psychological abuse is a behavior used to control or damage someone's emotional well being. Economic, financial abuse happens when the abuser makes a victim financially dependent on the abuser, giving them no power or feeling stuck in the relationship. Stalking and harassment happens between strangers or in relationships where the abusive partner or ex demands your time even after you make it clear you do not want contact. Sexual abuse is any unwanted sexual activity that is usually forced upon someone. In 1641, the Massachusetts Bay Colony enacted the first law against wife beating. It also prohibited parents from exercising any unnatural severity with their children. During this time, attitudes toward children were evolving from seeing them as economic assets to seeing them as emotionally rewarding beings to be nurtured. So, just a little short glimpse of how parents would involve their children in labor. So, an example is using them in the fields, um, which indicates hot environment. They may be malnourished and things like that. In 1874, the first Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was founded. 40 years later, there were 494 of them. There are two ways to look at domestic violence. The first one is the political model of domestic violence. It highlights the relations of power and authority between men and women. Social structure has supported men's control over women through law and social custom. For example, the rule of thumb, a rule in English law that allows husbands to hit his wife. The second one is the medical model of domestic violence. Domestic violence is seen as an illness and a source of injuries through this medical model. Some have argued that both the perpetrator and victims of violence suffer from various syndromes, which are illness like symptoms, injuries, and attitudes that need to be treated. Professionals point to links between being violent and such personal problems as a history of abuse as a child, alcoholism, or mental illness. So, some changes that were made after being introduced to domestic violence. So, within 5 years, every state had enacted laws that required medical personnel to report suspected cases of child abuse. A little back history: the feminist movement had fought to remove the social support of male violence. By the end of the 1970s, nearly every state had enacted laws to protect women from violence through a mixture of support services, including funds for crisis centers and shelters for battered women, requirements that physicians report suspected cases, and tougher criminal procedures. In 2013, Congress reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, which for the first time extended support services to victims of violence in same sex partnerships as well. There are two types of intimate partner violence. The first one is situational couple violence. It arises through a specific situation, not a long term pattern, rarely resulting in serious injury. So it really depends on the situation or the argument that the couples are experiencing. And the second one is coercive, controlling violence. It is a repeated pattern that involves beating one's partner, mostly perpetrated by men, and more likely to cause injuries. In this type of violence, husbands seek to dominate their wives by instilling fear of physical consequences of disobeying and keeping them economically dependent on him. Child abuse is seen as serious physical harm, trauma, sexual abuse with injury, or willful malnutrition of a child by an adult with intent to injure. It can produce inappropriate sexual behavior, feelings of betrayal, lack of trust, and powerlessness. Some later life consequences lead to a poor self-image, depression, and a lack of clear sense of boundaries between oneself and others. It can also lead to brain injuries and growth retardation. It is associated with behavior problems such as aggression, increased risk of getting arrested for violence. Of about 1,100 fatalities in 1999 from child abuse, 86% involved children under 6, and almost half have involved children under 1. Elder abuse is known to be physical abuse or neglect of an elderly person by a caregiver. A National Academy of Sciences report estimates 1 to 2 million elderly Americans have been injured, exploited, or otherwise mistreated by a caregiver. The most common of elderly abuse is neglect or financial exploitation. So, a good example, since I've worked in an old folks' home, is they could just be prescribing the wrong medication accidentally or on purpose, or they could just be giving them more or less medication than they should be. So to tie it into family systems theory, the family systems theory is a theory introduced by Dr. Murray Bowen, which my interpretation is that a family should be interconnected and interdependent on one another. There should be boundaries set in place. However, if the family fails to do so, behaviors could transfer onto the other members, which may create dysfunction in the family as a whole. As parents who are in charge of the family system, they should ensure that there are healthy boundaries in regards to parenting and addressing any links to abuse that they may have experienced growing up. There are multiple ways that problems may develop in the family. It could come from marital conflict, dysfunction in one spouse, impairment of one or more children, and emotional distance. The same effect goes for children who could be damaged in the long run, like depression, or they could carry on the violent cycle when they reach adulthood. Domestic violence creates emotional distance through lack of trust, powerlessness, and overall dysfunction in the family system. So some theories from the book is social exchange perspective, which is a theory that people calculate whether to engage in a particular behavior by considering the rewards and costs of that behavior and the rewards of alternatives to it. For example, if a husband feels like beating his wife will force her to contribute money, he would consider beating her for that reward, although it may come with the cost of his wife wanting a divorce. He is willing to make an exchange if the reward is greater than the cost. Another theory is frustration aggression perspective, which is a theory that aggressive behavior occurs when a person is blocked from achieving a goal, which could be economic inequalities, high unemployment rates, racial discrimination limits, or their ability to find a job. Anger or frustration is placed onto a safer target, which is either the spouse or child. In this approach, violence is seen as an emotional outburst of displaced anger. Social learning perspective, or the social learning theory, is a theory that individuals learn behavior they will later exhibit by observing what others do and seeing the consequences of these actions. Children that come from violent homes observe violent behavior, which could affect their thought process in regards to violence as being an acceptable way of control. Or it could mean the opposite. From seeing it so many times, they could learn to do differently. Children who witness violence are more likely to hit their children when they become parents. So, my views on domestic violence, I think seeking help through resources or authorities should be more normalized. I think people should be more accepting and comfortable of receiving help. I also think couples should consider therapy before it gets to the point where the relationship becomes abusive. As a program leader at an after school program, I believe teachers or people who deal with children should step in if they feel a child is being abused at home. Also, failure to report could have legal consequences as well. Before conceiving a child, I think couples should heal their childhood trauma first, especially if they have been through um, domestic violence when they were younger, and they could receive therapy as a couple or individually or both, um, but just to make sure that the cycle doesn't continue, and they could be the ones to stop that cycle and to ensure that their child, if they are planning to have one or have one already, is not going to be a part of that statistic of domestic violence. And here are my references. Thank you so much for watching and for listening.